Enlever pour le moment comme ça, il commence. Il faut prendre le microphone.
Okay. Тепер? Тепер мене чути добре. Окей, добре.
Good evening, dear colleagues. Glory to Jesus Christ. Now this evening I'm blessed to introduce the seminar of Ukrainian Christian Academic Society, which is dedicated to the one very actual topic, I would say, primacy, Catholicity, and world governance. Now, in the new conditions of our world, connected to different features like globalization, technical globalization, COVID, etc., etc. So many new things that are storming now Christianity. We are thinking of which style of way of governance for the world church we need to engage. And now, this evening, we have two guests which will defend their positions. One of them will express his pro and contra for the more centralization of the church governance, and another one will stress more.
Yes, I'm sorry, last comment. So, can you check whether your dynamic all is off.
Now? Is it good now? Чути добре? Окей?
This our evening panel aims to explore the question of universal authority in the new context of technological development and globalization, and to examine how this new context impacts relationships between universality and particularity. And I am especially honored to present first our guest, Father, professor, who came from France, born in Marseille, and trained as first as an engineer before becoming a priest. He earned his doctorate in theology with the study the ecclesiology of Richard Neybour. He's director, actually, of the licentiate of sacred theology in the Catholic University of Paris. He teaches theology of the Church, theology of ministries of the Vatican II, and directed doctoral seminar on ecumenism and Jewish Christian dialogue. Now he is director of Higher Institute of Ecumenical Studies at Paris Catholic University, Faculty of Theology and Religious Sciences. Director also of the canonical license in theology, a member of French oratory, a member of the Denton Band. Okay, the floor is yours, dear Father, please.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank the Institute of Ecumenical Studies of the Ukrainian Catholic University for the invitation. It's a great honor for me to be here and to have such an opportunity to discover your country, this city and your country 30 years after my first visit when I was young. I am delighted to participate to this conference. I am this year on sabbatical year, so I'm not anymore. All the titles you gave me were right last year. This year I am on sabbatical year. I will try to share my screen, so give me 1 minute to share it. I hope it will work.
Yes.
It's okay. So the title of my paper is Catholicity or Universality towards ecumenical form of governance for the global church. Well, the question is, does Catholicity mean universality? And what does exactly mean Catholicity if it is not this equivalence is not true? On the 27th of March last year, there was this extraordinary moment of prayer presided over by Pope Francis. It has been at the same time a very moving moment of world communion and the visible triumph of the universalist ecclesiology, in which the world needs only one minister, the Pope. And because of the strict confinement in many countries, he was the only one able to speak publicly in the name of the world humanity. We are all on the same planet, same boat, all of us fragile and disoriented, but at the same time important and needed. All of us called to row together, each of us in the need of comforting the other. On this boat are all of us. So the question is, in this moment of prayer, the Pope was the only minister of the world. And it's true that in the usual description of the Roman primacy, there is a conviction that the power of the Pope is universal, which means that it concerns immediately all members of the Catholic Church. In virtue of his office, that is, as Vicar of Christ and Pastor of the World Church, the Roman Pontiff has full, supreme, and universal power of the Church, and is always free to exercise its power. And that means it's clear, universalem potestatem. It's not the only example of confusion between Catholicity and universality. In the Protestant Church of Switzerland, it is a federation of 25 member churches, 24 cantonal churches, and the Evangelical Methodist Church of Switzerland. They decided to make one Protestant church, which is a federation for relations with the state and relations with other church in other countries. And it's interesting because the Constitution says that the Protestant Church in Switzerland is part of the one holy, universal, and apostolic church. It is true in the 4 official languages of the Confederation, the Swiss Confederation. It means that they do not want to employ the word Catholic. They use the word universal. So because they don't want they want to be a Protestant church and not a Catholic church. So they reinforce the monopole of the Roman Catholic Church, even the Latin Roman Catholic Church, on the word Catholicity. So to make the difference, because probably there is a difference between Catholicity and universality, I will have the four languages. We have also the language of the Romansh, which is a little part of Switzerland. I will have 2 points. First, the political and clinical conditions of the confusion between Catholicity and universality. And second point, the new conditions for the governance of the world.
One moment. I'll maybe switch off my microphone and you turn on.
Oh, that's fine. You can hear well.
Someone is saying that the voice is bad.
Okay, so maybe I can. Let's try. Okay,
I turn my off.
Is it better with like this? Yeah, I can see Ludmila. Yeah, okay, thank you. So first point, the political and ecumenical conditions of the confusion between Catholicity and universality. How can we explain such a confusion between two different words? And what kind of differences are we able to make between the two words, Catholic and universal? Is it the same thing, or is there any difference? Indeed, the universalist understanding of the Catholicity of the Church is widely attested in the apologetic literature of the two previous centuries. I give one example with this book from the apologetic, an apologetic book of theology, of ecclesiology, l'Église catholique, and it's very interesting because one of the major arguments for this kind of apologetics was the spread of the Catholic Church over the world surface of the planet. So numerical and geographical extension is necessary for Catholicity to be a note of the Church. So you see that the first conditions for Catholicity in this literature is geographical one. The point is to demonstrate that the Roman Catholic Church is not only the true church, but the only one indeed. So all apologetics, I quote, all apologists teach, and rightly so, that notes, being intended to make known to the world the properties of the true church, must manifest themselves externally, possessing sufficient visibility to impose themselves as ground for credibility on all sorts of goodwill. So, the demonstration, this is apologetic. We want to demonstrate that we are the true church and the only one, I would say. And to be sure that we are the only one, we are a church all over the world. So this is the first, I would say, geographical conception of universality. But in fact, Ambroise de Poulpiquet, a young Dominican theologian at this time, wanted to make a transformation, because he wanted to go from a quantitative universalism to a qualitative universalism. That is, it is not a question of being all over the world and to being the most numerous church, but it's a quality of being a church. And he said, in his teachings, I quote, Jesus fights against national particularism, which restricts the universalism of the kingdom of heaven to the narrow and earthly perspective of the interest of a country. We know how vigorously Jesus fought against this particularism and how jealously he guarded the nobility of his religious ideal from all the mésalliances of Jewish nationalism. It is very interesting because, for Poulpiquet, for Ambroise de Poulpiquet, it is clear that there is no place in the Roman Catholic Church for particularism, whether it is related to persons, to cultures, or to nations. So we understand the double context of this confusion between Catholicity and universality. Double context. First, there is a Catholic unionism, that is, all churches must return to Rome. This is the perspective of Pius XII in Mystici Corporis. All the churches must go back to Rome. This is the way they understand unionism. And the second question, a geopolitical context, so the rise of nationalism and World War I. What Poulpiquet said about national particularism or nationalism was at the time just before the First World War, so the time of rising nationalism in the world in Europe, especially, of course. So these are the two conditions, you know, a Catholic unionism first, and second, the rise of nationalism. For example, Benedict XV, in one of his texts after the war, was able to say that, for example, I quote, "The Church will certainly not refuse a zealous aid to the state united under the Christian law in any of their undertakings, inspired by justice and charity, in as much as she is herself the most perfect type of universal society." So in front of what was World War I, Benedict XV thought the church as the universal society. At the moment where the nations were creating the Society of Nations, his idea of the Catholic Church was to be the perfect universal society. She possesses, the church, the Roman Catholic Church, of course, not the others, that's obvious. She possesses in our organization and institutions a wonderful instrument for bringing this brotherhood among men, not only for their eternal salvation, but also for the material well-being to the sure acquisition of eternal blessings. You know, the church is above the nations. The nations are divided by nationalism, could be divided by nationalism, and the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, is above, and the image of the ideal society of a world society. It is obvious with Pius XII, you know, according to Pius XII. I quote an historian, Italian historian, Andrea Riccardi, he was the founder of Sant'Egidio, and he is a famous historian. And I quote him: "The return to Rome is the key to interpreting all attempts at unity in the contemporary world," until Vatican II, of course. It is so for Christian unity, which is incompatible with the acceptance of the primacy of the Pope. And it is also the case for the international community, which is fragile without the moral foundation of the church magisterium. So, you know, the Roman Catholic Church is the model of the universal society. And you see a pious image, which is very interesting. It's Pius XI with people from all over the world, you know, from all continents, just being united under of course, under the obedience to the Pope, who is the Roman Pontiff, is the Pastor Universal. Here, you know, Catholic means universal. That's absolutely obvious. So this representation will change with Vatican II. So, you know, the political and ecumenical conditions of the confusion were, first, the Roman Catholic Church is the only one, and second, the nations are divided by nationalism, and the world wars were the proof of this nationalism, and the Roman Catholic Church is the perfect society. So with Vatican II, what happened? Well, there are the new conditions for the governance of a world church. And of course, I will start with Paul VI, especially in this moment where he was at the United Nations. It was the first visit of a Pope to the headquarters of United Nations in New York City. Pope John Paul II has been twice in New York, Benedict once, and Pope Francis once. And Paul VI, so for his first visit to United Nations, said, "Your charter, the charter of the United Nations, goes even further, and our message moves ahead with it. You are in existence and you are working in order to unite nations, to associate states. Let us use the formula to bring together each other. You are an association, you, United Nations, a bridge between peoples, a network of relations between states. We are tempted to say that in a way, this characteristic of yours reflects in the temporal order what our Catholic Church intends to be in the spiritual order, one and universal." So, you know, the situation is completely different from Pius XII. The Catholic Church is not above the nations, but it's parallel to the United Nations. What United Nations are making on the temporal sphere, we, Catholic Church, we are doing the same thing in the spiritual order. And he goes on, who can fail to see the need of an importance of thus gradually coming to the establishment of a world authority capable of taking effective actions on the juridical and political planes? It is interesting because there is an invitation from Paul VI to the United Nations to have a world authority. So here there is not only a parallel between the Roman Catholic Church and the United Nations, but a projection of what is the Catholic Church on the United Nations. Like the Church who has a world authority, the Pope indeed, the United Nations should have the same system of power, which is a bit contradictory with what is United Nations. It is the principle of equality between each member of United Nations. So there is a kind of projection, because the Pope urges the United Nations to organize a form of global authority. So you can see how the way of understanding Catholicity and universality can have consequences of invitation to the United Nations. But indeed, when we look at Vatican II, and especially one number of Lumen Gentium, the Constitution of the Church, number 13, it's interesting to see what is Catholicity. Catholicity is explained with new accents, articulating Catholicity and particularity. The Church, said Lumen Gentium, takes nothing away from the temporal welfare of any people. On the contrary, it fosters and takes to itself, insofar as they are good, the ability, riches, and customs in which the genius of each people expresses itself. Taking them to itself, it purifies, strengthens, elevates, and ennobles them. So you see, the Catholicity is not a universality, abstract universality, but the fact that all the particularity of the cultures are purified, strengthened, and elevated and ennobled by the Church. This presentation of the Church thus prohibits any nationalization of the Church, of course, but also corrects the representation of an international society, which would be above the peoples, since it is at the same time interior to the intimate characteristics of the latter. So the Catholic Church is not above the people, but it is inside each people and can never be nationalized at the same time. I go on with Lumen Gentium number 13 to show what are the consequences of the understanding of Catholicity, which is different from universality, as you can see. In virtue of this Catholicity, so not universality, each individual part contributes through its special gift to the good of the other parts and of the world Church. Through the common sharing of gifts and through the common effort towards in fullness in unity, the whole of and each of the parts receive increase. So, Catholicity means a kind of circulation between each particularity. So Catholicity, what is Catholicity? And I go on quoting Lumen Gentium. Diversity of members within the Church, first. Diversity of local churches. I need to put a capital to churches, local churches with a big C, under the vigilance of the Church with a big C of Rome. And third, sharing spirituality, apostolic workers, and temporal resources. So, it's interesting because it's the first time in the Constitution on the Church that the material question is written. Temporal resources. It means that Catholicity is not only a question of sharing prayers, but also sharing money, sharing people, spirituality, sharing prayer, spirituality, sharing men and women, apostolic workers, and sharing money. So it's interesting because Catholicity means a kind of circulation between each local churches and under the vigilance of the Church of Rome, of course. So Catholicity is not therefore primarily a geographical or a numerical category, but refers to the very specific forms of communion between local churches, which are able of exchanging gifts and receiving them under the vigilance of the ministry of primacy, recognized by the Bishop of the Church of Rome. So, and this organization of universal, of this organization properly Christian of the universal, constitutes a very specific way of responding to the missionary vocation of the church, and forbids any temptation to present Catholicity as a model for the international institutions. And it's interesting to see that Pope Francis very recently gave some example of this understanding of Catholicity in Fratelli Tutti, because there are two numbers very important on this point of view, number 100 and number 278. First, I am certainly not proposing, I quote the Pope Francis, an authoritarian and abstract universalism devised or planned by a small group or presented as an ideal for the sake of leveling, dominating, and plundering. One model of globalization, in fact, consciously aims at the one-dimensional uniformity and seeks to eliminate all differences and traditions in a superficial quest for unity. And the other number, which is very important according to me, quite at the end of the encyclic, called to take root in every place. The church has been present for centuries throughout the world, for that is what it means to be Catholic. You have a definition of what is to be Catholic, is to be in every place, to be inside the culture, inside what people are living. And you see the photo with Indian, Pope Francis congratulating Indian people. She can thus understand for her own experience of grace and sin, the beauty of invitation to universal love. So there is a call to be universal, but the call to be universal means to be Catholic, which is to be inside the particularities of each local church in communion, so in a way of exchanging gifts. I conclude by telling two different things. First, it's interesting to see that in such a presentation of what is Catholicity, you have to articulate ecumenical issues and geopolitical context. It's not only a question of doctrine, it's always a question of understanding the relation between ecumenical issues, doctrinal issues, and geopolitical context. Of course, this means at the same time ecumenical progress. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church has to be very engaged in ecumenical progress, and to have institutional reforms to be sure that Catholicity is effectively exchange of gifts. And what could be a good opportunity for us is the next anniversary, the 17th century anniversary of the Council of Nicaea, because it will be a moment to be at the same time more universal in our purpose and more Catholic, which is always exchanging gifts, as I am experiencing being here in Lviv. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Father Luke, for your presentation, and you gave us so much material to reflect on, I guess. And now I'm giving floor to Pavlo Smytsnyuk, actually director of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies. He graduated from Roman Seminary, University of Athens, and taking his doctorate in political theology in the Oxford. So his topic will be the uneasy business of Catholicity.
Which microphone are we using?
Yours.
So then you can switch it off.
Yeah. Okay.
And also the. Okay, can you hear me now? Yes, can you make a sign that you can hear me? Yes, okay. The topic of my presentation is the uneasy business of universality, Western and Eastern struggles with Catholicity. Yesterday, there was a conference in Kiev to commemorate Union of Brest, the act of union which gave rise to the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and our own Taras Kurlet spoke there. It was organized by Oleg Turi, director of History Institute here at UCU. There was the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Sviatoslav Shevchuk, and there was a papal nuncio. The nuncio said, I am Roman Catholic, but as apostolic nuncio, I am also Greek Catholic. And everybody, an applause followed. The question which arises at this point is to what extent this can be possibly true. To what extent can Rome represent not only itself, but everybody? Is Pope and his representatives something supra-particular, not just Roman, but Roman and Greek and Coptic and Armenian and Syro-Barbar, etc. In brief, universal. So this question introduces, I think, what I'm going to say today. So the question I'm trying to address is the following. Is Catholic authority, by which I mean a holistic representation of such a type which is respectful of particularity, possible? Is not what we take for universal, is just a properly framed particular. Now, postcolonial critique points out what is often considered as universal is but Western. For example, Daniel Dubuisson argues that the West has the tendency to consider its own particular worldview as universal and to project it onto the rest of the world. I call this a pars pro toto maneuver, when a part, the Western part of the world, pretends to be the totality of what exists. Now, the tautology between the Western and universal, pointed out by the post-colonial critique, seems to have a parallel within the ecclesiastical domain, in a tension between particularity and universality. In what follows, I would like to propose two ecclesiological study cases in which I argue we can try to find a similar tension within Christian theology. The first case is the relationship between the Catholicity of the Catholic Church and its Western or Latin element. The second case study is the tension between ethnicity and ecumenicity within Hellenic Orthodoxy, in particular the Patriarchate of Constantinople, which is also called ecumenical. Now, to my first case study. In the Roman Catholic Church, besides the Latin rite, there are 5 other liturgical rites corresponding to 2 dozens of churches sui juris, or particular churches such as Melkite, Maronite, Syro-Malabar, etc. The Catholic Church is headed by Pope, and the Pope is somebody who has several identities or jobs, one could say. If a bit blasphemously one could compare the papacy to a matryoshka, the Russian doll, one could say that the Pope is made of several dolls. Yeah, the matryoshka, which is made of the Bishop of Rome, of Metropolitan of the Roman province, the Primate of Italy, the Primate of the Latin Church, head of the Vatican City State, etc. The question, of course, is to what extent various papal dolls coexist, coincide, and encompass each other. The absorption of various minor titles by that of the head of the Universal Church was the fruit of a long development, which as a musical crescendo matured from early Christianity to the modern polyglot globetrotter and twittering papacy. Historically, the distinction between papal primacy in the Universal Church and his authority in the West was crystallized within the context of the pentarchy of 5 patriarchates. The Pope was in a particular way responsible for the Latin churches. During the second millennium, however, the universal ministry of the Bishop of Rome coincided with his patriarchal service, and Pope became sort of Papa Universalis, promulgating the canon law and establishing feasts for all the church, appointing or confirming every singular bishop, directly addressing every Catholic believer, and even all men of goodwill. The renunciation of the historical title of the Patriarch of the West by Benedict XVI was the logical conclusion of this process. And I suggested one of the key factors in this development was the influence of political ideas of empire on the theology. The connection between the universalism of the Bishop of Rome's mission and Roman imperialism is the question of political theology. That is the co-influence between theological and political ideas. According to Jonia Prat, a French historian of the church, empire, I quote, is as it were a reference princeps of the Latin church, end quote. Similarly, Goudot says that the capacity of a place to take in its particularity a universal dimension finds one of its roots in imperial Rome, in which urbs becomes orbis. Yes, the city becomes the universe. This imitatio imperii, the imitation of empire by the Church of Rome, was accomplished through the transferring of imperial titles, insignia, property, and most important, imperial glory from the emperor to the pope. This process is called by Ernst Kantorowicz imperialization of the church. Kantorowicz argues that by the 12th century, the Roman church was conceived of and styled accordingly as the true and new Imperium Romanum. The world has become pope-centered. The harmony of the cosmos was no longer reflected in the concord of various social groups. The whole was represented by the Pope alone, end quote. Now, Luke a bit earlier said that Pope Paul VI transposed the universal frame of the Catholic Church on the UN. In a way, it's a sort of politicization of theology. Yeah, the Catholic Church is UN should follow the Catholic Church. Now, the process which I described, yes, the imperialization of the church, we have almost the contrary. Yes, the politics is being sacralized. So it almost closes a cycle. Now, the highest point of this process can be seen in the Dictatus Papae, which postulates that only the Roman pontiff can be legally called universal. It is not coincidental that Rome's self-understanding occurred in the moment when Rome stopped conceiving of itself as one of the pentarchy of Asian patriarchates and began to live auto-sufficiently as an ecumeny of its own. In a certain sense, the whole of Western Christianity got incorporated into the Church of Rome. As Yves Congar points out, the very adjective Romana ecclesia, which under the 5th century indicated the local Church of Rome, later on became the adjective of the whole Latin Church and all Catholic Church. This Romanization affected in particular way the Orientals within the Catholic Church, who became subjects to an approach described as Latinization. Now, these developments have been viewed with discomfort by many Eastern Catholics. The Second Vatican Council promulgated the decree Orientaliorum Ecclesiarum, which insisted on the equal dignity of the Eastern Catholic churches with that of the Latin Rite. However, no document on the Latin Rite Church was adopted at the Council, which suggests a certain asymmetry, implies that the Catholic and the Latin Church are still perceived as identical categories, and then somewhere you have Oriental Catholics. I would suggest that a step toward proposing a new balance of authority, more respectful of communio in diversity, would be to distinguish the patriarchal authority of the Pope over the Latin Church from his service as the pastor of the Universal Church. As, for example, his episcopal ministry for the Roman diocese is distinguished from the Pope's role as the head of the Vatican city-state. What is urgently needed is a reflection on the particular character of Latinity, besides other ritual traditions within the Catholic Church. Or, to put it in different terms, a reflection on the Latin Church as ecclesia sui juris. According to Adam de Ville, the Latin Church should be provided with institutions which could express its own Latinitas, as it were. De Ville proposes a creation of, I quote, a synod the Latin Church as a whole, as well as regional patriarchates within the world of the Latin tradition, each with proper institutions. The election of bishops, glorification of saints, control over liturgy and ecclesial institutions, some doctrinal supervision and other functions performed today by the Pope and Roman Curia can be made the responsibility of the patriarchates. De Ville then formulates responsibilities that would remain to the Pope in his unique capacity as the first hierarch or supreme pontiff of the Universal Church. I would suggest that de Ville's proposal seems to devolve the Pope from his patriarchal authority rather than separate the latter from the Pope's service to the Universal Church. However, the proposal offers a creative way to delineate the two functions merged into the papacy. A proposal in a similar direction is made by Ivan Detsko, who claims that within the ecclesiological and canonical framework of the Catholic Church, I quote, there is a clear difference between the exercise of the authority of Roman Pontiff toward the Latin Church, which historically coincides with the Western Patriarchate, and the exercise of the same authority in the Church toward the Oriental Catholic Churches sui juris, end quote. Detsko proposes a reform of the current code of canons of the Eastern churches in order to limit the interventions of the Roman Curia in the life of Oriental Catholics. Now, I do not wish to suggest that the problem lies exclusively on the side of Rome. Many Oriental Christians are more than happy being Roman. Until today, we Ukrainian Greek Catholics commemorate Pope during the liturgy under the title of Wselensky Archierei, Universal Bishop. It's funnily enough, this title is a translation of the title which was used not for the Pope, but for the Ecumenical Patriarch. So in a way, it suggests that we imagine the Pope to be our Patriarch. Why would we need another Patriarch who would govern the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church if we have already the Pope? Yes, it is a dangerous, dualism. For the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church during the communist persecution, fidelity to Christ was concentrated in unity with Rome. It was the latter that became almost the incarnation of church and faith. Now, this last point is important because it suggests that the authority of Pope is not only a matter of canon law, but rather a matter of charismatic and mystical authority, which hardly can be regulated in a juridical way. So the Oriental Catholics themselves have a long way to go. Now let me pass to the second part of my paper, to the Orthodox. I would like to show that a similar mechanism of the substitution of locality with universality exists also within Orthodoxy. The Orthodox Church is presented, and often rightly so, as more synodal and attentive to the particular. However, the manner in which the synodality is realized is often questioned. The tension between the universal and ecumenical, or ecumenical, and the particular has emerged with great force in the 19th century, when the Orthodox churches in various countries taught autocephaly, a sort of ecclesial correspondent to the sovereignty of the nation states. An important element that allows us to contextualize the struggle for autocephaly was the fact that the Patriarchate of Constantinople was acting as a Hellenizing force among the non-Greek Orthodox believers under its jurisdiction. According to Daniel Payne, under the leadership of the Greek Patriarch, a process of Grecification has occurred to ensure ecclesiastical unity in the millet, which was a Christian or Orthodox communion within the Ottoman Empire. Instead of the use of Church Slavonic in the Slav churches, the Greek liturgy and practice were enforced, especially in the mid to late 19th century. Then, as a reaction to the independence of the Balkan churches, the Council of Constantinople condemned in 1872 a national approach to ecclesiology, defined as ethnophilitism. This decision can be interpreted as a preference for universalism over nationalism. On the other hand, however, one could argue that the Council's decision promoted a local, a Hellenic universalism, an inclusion of the world into the new ecumene of the Byzantine Empire. If you follow the second reading, the condemnation of ethnophilitism is not a preference for universalism over nationalism, but, as Cyril Hovorun puts it, a victory of imperial nationalism over ethnic nationalism. A parallel to the Papa Universalis, to which I alluded already, can be found in the Ecumenicos Patriarchis, ecumenical patriarch, title used by the Archbishop of Constantinople, New Rome, until today. At the moment of the institutional adoption of the title by John IV, the pastor at the end of the 6th century, it provoked sharp criticism. Unsurprisingly, but somehow ironically, the criticism came also from Rome, which argued that the title of universality jeopardizes the dignity not of the Pope, but of every bishop. Some centuries later, however, the Bishop of Rome himself would adopt the title of universal. So, Romanitas of the Catholic theology has a parallel in Hellenism within Orthodoxy. For example, Christos Yanaras articulates the dichotomy between ecumenical and national by comparing Orthodox Hellenism to the ethnocentric orthodoxy of some autocephalous churches. Hellenism is presented in terms of a universality of civilization, which makes Greeks citizens of the world, as opposed to parochial ethnicism. Yanaras argues that the message of Hellenism and of Orthodoxy knows no national or racial boundaries. It is an ecumenical message, an invitation to life for every human person. Greece was never a place, it was always a way of life with ecumenical dimensions, as quote, end quote. On the other hand, Yanaras insists that the Catholicity of the Church should transcend national or linguistic homogeneity. The more a people, a bearer of national cultural tradition, transcends the egoistic affirmation of its particularity, the wider Catholicity it acquires, says Yanaras. From this point of view, one may conclude that Hellenism as a cultural unit is something that ought to be transcended by the Church's Catholicity. But there is no trace of this logic when Ras deals with concrete cases. Only Hellenism is able to transcend and deny its own ethnic essence. No other culture seems to be able to perform such a transcendence. This leads to the conclusion that Ras is unable to see the transcendence of particularity anywhere outside of Hellenism. As Pandelis Kalaizidis observes, Ras seems to imply that those who do not participate in the Greek culture ipso facto do not fully participate in the fullness of Christian life. This brief analysis of Ras points out an ambiguity between Hellenic orthodoxy as simultaneously a part and a totality of ecclesial experience. Now, the time will not allow me, but I think one can draw a similar pars pro toto game in the way the Russian Orthodox Church articulates itself as being, on the one hand, transnationally Russian, Ruska, in the ancient meaning of the term, thus embracing all the identities of Eastern Slavs. And on the other hand, it's ethnically, even nationally Russian, yes, representing Russian-speaking Christianity and sometimes Mr. Vladimir Putin. We are again in a framework of an imperial understanding of the church, where it's not always clear what is universal, what is particular. Now I conclude. I suggested that political and theological perspectives benefit from being in dialogue with each other concerning the question of universality and universal governance. I pointed out the dependence of various approaches on the theological and juridical understanding of the church from the idea of empire. But what does this being an empire by the church implies? What alternative models does it exclude? Where does this imitation lie? Now, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, in their bestseller on empire, argue that perhaps the fundamental characteristic of imperial sovereignty is that its space is always open, end quote. This would be a major difference between empire and a nation state. Nation state would be preoccupied with ethnic and geographical borders, but not the empire. One could then wonder whether Latinization or Hellenization do not actually challenge the possibility of imagining Rome or Constantinople as empire. If by empire we understand both the openness to encompass other cultures and usages, then Latinization or Hellenization, rather than being imperialist, would be parallel to the imposition of homogeneity by the modern nation state. The study cases discussed above highlight the difficulty or perhaps impossibility of a truly Christian universalism. Having seen the practical deficiency of the articulation between locality and universality, a theologian is presented with an unexpectedly radical questions. Is universality ever possible in a pre-eschatological reality before the realization of the kingdom of God? Or rather, does any manner of being universal necessarily constitute an a priori filed attempt to impose one's particularity and others? I leave these questions to you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Pavlo, for your presentation. And now I would suggest first for the present people here to put the questions, or anyone from the auditorium from the Zoom, please raise your virtual hand, or write me please in the chat. I'll put this question in the.
Okay. I will briefly start with the question addressed to Pavlo. I just wanted to make more that if you can make more specific this argument advanced by, as far as I understood, by Jan Ras, that by virtue of the gospel being expressed in terms of Hellenic culture, no one can remain faithful to the gospel or Christian without being actively involved, or at least understanding Hellenistic culture, Hellenic culture. I can understand the logic of this argument partially because of the incarnational and historical structure of Christianity as revealed, religion revealed in certain space and time and culture. But does he make any distinction between historical Hellenistic culture of the first century and kind of meta-historical Hellenismos, as is imagined by some Greek nationalists, I think, a culture that extends from Plato or Homer till today, which I think is just a mythical construct and is not very solidly grounded in any sociological or philological or any other reality.
Okay, thank you very much. So, you know Forestier, yes, and his idea of and his idea of a universal value of talent. Yes. Yeah. So the idea is might seem I don't know, a bit crazy, but I think in practice, Forestier is true. When Forestier speaks about normativity of Hellenism, I think he is wrong at a philosophical level, but he is right descriptively, because we never managed to translate, yes, the Christian faith with concepts that are different from the Greek, nature, substance, accidents, vocabulary.
As well as from biblical Hebrew.
As well, yes. But I think if the Christ or Christian message got translated from biblical Hebrew or from Aramaic, whatever language Jesus was speaking, into Greek, we never managed to translate this from Greek philosophy into any other philosophy. Yeah, so there is this incapacity of speaking about God and his attributes, yes, in a vocabulary that is not Hellenistic. So Borowski is asking the right question, whether this is just a contingency of history, or whether this is something that is providential. So in a way, Borowski says that the Greek church fathers are so providential for the Christian doctrine as such that you can't do it without them. And probably you can't do a meta-patristic theology. Now, Jan Ras, he goes further, because he says he speaks not only about the Greek church father, he adds also Hellenic philosophers. Yes, so he says that actually the early Christianity, even by calling itself the church, ecclesia, it chooses a political concept. Ecclesia to demo, yes, the reunion of a city of population, and Jan Ras says the early church doesn't call itself as synagogue, yes, synagogue, although it could have imagined itself. It doesn't imagine itself as New Israel, but rather as a community of demons, as a political, therefore, entity of the Greek polis. Yeah? So, if in Forestier we have the church fathers, Jan Ras adds also the Heraclitus living according to truth, and all the Greek philosophy, ancient pre-Christian Greek philosophy. And Jan Ras also adds modern Greece. So in a way, if for Forestier, this like universal value of Hellenism resides in church fathers, Yanaras draws a line between ancient Greek philosophy, then church fathers, and then Byzantine Empire and modern Greece. In fact, he criticizes the West, yeah, for being unable to live in community, and often says that Greece is a place where you can still, find this true church. Now, he is more nuanced than that. He says, oh, the Greece has also been westernized. So if you see something that is not the very pure church, this is because of the bloody West. But in this renders his project also prone to national, which probably is inexistent in Forestier. He doesn't care about Greek nation. While in Yanaras, the connection between ancient Greek philosophy, church fathers, Byzantine Empire, and modern Hellenic Republic goes through one line, and you can't see this in any other culture.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Because I've got the question here in the chat from Andrei Tretyak. I suppose this is for both speakers. I have the question about contemporary globalization tendencies. How does this phenomena impact church self-understanding as universal? Are we not witnessing the decline of old identities, including Latin or Hellenic one? If so, does church need to make some new one in the line with the post-culture?
Do you want him to repeat?
Yeah, no, it's okay. I may answer. Or if you want.
Could you switch on your microphone?
I switch off my. I have to. So please answer because.
Okay, let's do this.
But mine is also switched, so I will speak into that.
Okay,
so
yeah, sure.
You can maybe without the mask, you can speak. Yeah, okay, speak up a little.
Okay, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. You will tell me. It's interesting. This question and the previous one are very interesting indeed because we always.
Voilà, mon micro marche. Yeah. The point is we risk to forget that the first questions come from the Bible itself, and from the Septante. I don't know the word in English. Septuagint, because it was a question: is it allowed to translate the Hebrew Bible in Greek? So the question is not a Christian one; it comes from Israel. To think about what is Christian identity, and I would prefer, personally, the word vocation. To think what is Christian vocation, which is completely different, because identity is by myself and vocation is always by another. I am called by another one, God, of course, for us. To think about the Christian identity leads us to return to the Bible and to the question of Israel. What and why Israel decided to translate its Bible in Greek. And this decision, much before Christ, of course, has great impact, well, till now, I would say. So, according to me, the main question is, in this reflection about the Christian vocation, not to forget that we come from Israel. This would be one answer.
So, should I switch my microphone?
Yes.
So you switch your off. So I think there are several components to answer the question about globalization. First of all, it didn't start today, yes, or yesterday. It's yes, Bruno Latour has this book, We've Never Been Modern, and I think globalization, you can say, started centuries ago. in Ukraine, we use the liturgical rite, which was crafted for us by Greeks. Yes, I know that, yes. That's my neighbor here at the table, Vasil Rudejko, maybe will disagree, but what we consider to be part of our cultural tradition was not written by us. We translated it more or less correctly, but we got it as a gift from somebody else. The same with the Latin rite. I don't know the Indians or Filipinos who use the Latin rite. It was also something that was slowly imposed onto them, and so on. So Christianity probably as or Christendom was already sort of a globalized world in which, like, the princes exchanged, the nobility traveled, the armies traveled, etc. So I don't think that we are today, we probably are every day more globalized, but it's not something that has started only in the moment of what we call modernity. Certainly, today, it makes much less sense about speaking on East and West. Yes, what is West? What is East? Yes, when you go to Asia, is it West or not? My computer probably was made in China. So we live in the world which is, as we call it, globalized. And this certainly affects on the way we imagine the church. And I think what is affected by this, maybe more than in the past, is the question of territoriality. Eucharistic ecclesiology, yes, Metropolitan John Zizoulas insists on this idea, one bishop in one city. Now, the globalization undermines territoriality. People who travel, the migration, makes it difficult for people from various linguistic traditions to meet together. Perhaps we didn't try it. Eh? Perhaps it's our own, I don't know, our own fault that we didn't want to imagine the church as more cosmopolitan. But here again, yes, and I don't know, a New York parish or parish in Paris that will be for people of all languages, all rights. I don't know, on Malabars, Armenians, etc. Yeah, but the question is here: can you have this cosmopolitan culture, language, which will not be somebody's local one? So what I'm trying to say in my paper is that really any language is to a certain degree local. Any culture is to a certain degree local. And the liberal narrative about human rights, universality is also local and particular. So how does the church will deal with this? How will the church rethink territoriality? I think it's an open question, and whether it should be done or not, whether it will cause us more problems than gains, this I don't know.
Please to turn off your microphone. Now I'm giving Abraham Han express his will to put the questions, so now we unmute his microphone. Oh. No.
Can you still unmute himself?
Okay.
Oh,
yes, good morning. I don't have a question as such, but
because
okay. I don't have a question as such, but I do have a couple kind of comments or ideas that I want to share. and I'll be very brief. And I found both papers very interesting, but one of the things that kept recurring in my mind as I listened to both was simply this notion of a tension between, I don't mean a tension looking, but a pull tension between the idea of imperium as opposed to auctoritas. And I think in some respects, Pavlo's paper kind of picked that up with his reference to two bodies. Again, you asked the question whether it's possible to have a cosmopolitan kind of culture without kind of local considerations. And I guess maybe what I would have liked to hear a little bit more, and maybe it's not on this occasion really, is the tension or the incommensurability that is between imperium and auctoritas. Let me put it another way. Can you really have auctoritas without imperium? And let me just stop there.
Okay, thank you. Okay, could you switch on your microphone? Just would be better.
Yeah, you're right.
Well,
Okay.
thank you for this very difficult question and very relevant. Because the problem, according to me, is to think auctoritas in a singular form. The point, especially now, because we are in a process of synodality, we risk to understand authority with a singular word and not a plural word. I mean, in the Christian church, especially in the Catholic one, there are different authorities. Not only is there authority of the ministers, but first of all, I would say 4 types of authority. First of all, the authority of the liturgy, which is matricial, which is the beginning of, well, the matrix of the Christian life. Secondly, the authority of the Bible. Thirdly, the authority of the doctrine, and fourth position, the authority of ministers. So, with this kind of pluralistic authorities, it could be possible to understand authorities without imperium. If we say authority with only one word, it is difficult to escape from this very danger to think the church as a political body.
Okay, you can switch your microphone and I will then. Yes, thank you very much, Abraham, for the question. I think there are 2 approaches to that. First of all, I think it's very fundamental of whether the church as community is something radically different from any other community that exists in this world. So whether the otherness of the church transcends, I don't know, the anthropological or social rules, social cohesion rules that are there in creation. Yes, whether the leadership in a society at a social level is something that is that needs to be completely transcended, yes, by the event church or not. And one answer to this question can be, yes, the church is a completely different community. Yes, sometimes, yes, Jesus, when he instructs his apostles, says that among the people, the one who who is the leader does this, but among you, that should not be the case. Yes, and in this picture, the rules of leadership in the church, the ecclesiology is something different from politics. And from another point of view, there could be an argument that the church accomplishes the creation, builds on creation. So the social rules, the rules of leadership that are there in the society, they are the rules that the church deals with. Yes, so I think that's two different ways of putting together the spiritual and the material, the revealed and the given or the natural. This is first thing. Second thing is to what extent this authority can be different from power. Yes, so we classically made a distinction at different levels between authority and power. Yeah, I don't know whether you meant that or not, by power the same as imperium or not. Yeah, you have this distinction in Greek, yeah, exousia. You don't have it in Ukrainian, I think. Yeah. So it's also, you need to see how culturally specific this distinction can be. And I think to a certain degree, today the power became or felt the need to be much more charismatic than it might have been in the past. I think the modern papacy, with all this talk about synodality, became more powerful than it was, 50 years ago. I think that, television, traveling, canonization of popes, and probably the personal holiness of a lot of Roman pontiffs, yes, of the last century, may help them to transform the authority of the papal office into a power which is exercised in the church. But to a certain degree, it can be said that we can observe similar dynamics at the political level. What is populism? Populism is in a way to convince, yes, people who vote for you that you are a good fellow. Yeah? Ukraine is run by a comedian, very happily so. Yes, humor becomes power. I don't know to what extent. Yes, I addressed your question, Abraham.
Okay, I'm asking now the auditorium whether there are some other questions from all those who are connected to the Zoom or from the here. No, nobody. Okay. May I have the question to both of you? Now, listening to your presentations, I imagine the church, especially the Catholic Church, as the big power in the world. But I remember the prophetic article of that time, not even Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who says that Christianity in the future probably will be diminished in the numbers, will be switched into small communities, and we will be obliged to start from the beginning, like first Christian communities. How this question of power of universality will be relevant in the state of those small maybe communities, and the question of power here comes again into the ground, because power is supposed to be at that time transformed totally into authority, which means power not connected with the direct power, but with the more with the as a moral authority and not as political authority. I'm not sure whether I've been clear or not.
Thank you very Thank you for this very, very interesting question, because it showed that ecclesiology has always to deal with politics and political sciences, I would say. So the question of being one church in such a pluralistic world is not only a Christian question, but at the same time, a political question. How is it possible to build one nation in such a pluralistic world? How is it possible to build one continent and one world? And it's obvious that the ecological crisis is a big challenge for all humankind, because we are on the same boat, and we have no we have no other planet just to go. So the question of church unity is not only a question of theologians who have time and comfort to think in their libraries, but a very, very difficult and political question. So what kind of contribution churches can share, can bring to this main ecological and anthropological questions of our time? I would say that what could be our contribution is very, very modest. I would say that's very modest. When Benedict the XVI, what is sometimes described as the Benedictine option is presented, it is always with the idea that small is beautiful. That is a little community where is more or less easy to build, but a large church is impossible because we are too different. And if you just go further in this direction, you go to the ecclesial, which is the real church is the family church. I think it would be a little. There is a kind of a risk, according to me, to diminish the church to be only at the family level. Not only a parish, even the family. But it is true that you can have a Christian life in the family. It's obvious. It's not so easy. I do agree.
We can see that you are a celibate man. Yes.
Yeah, I am. But I have a family. I am celibate indeed, but I have a family. It is possible to have a parish. I've been parish priest during years. It's not so easy, as I know from my own experience. So it's difficult to just be happy with such a little comprehension of what is the church. According to me, to think Catholicity as the exchange of gifts between local churches is what could be the main contribution of the Christian churches to our big problems in our world. I think it means that we are, the way of living our Catholicity like an exchange of gifts. So we are able to receive gifts, because it's always more difficult to receive gifts than to give. We are able to receive gifts from people, from other churches, from people with disabilities, from poor, and not only from the rich and the most famous people. So we are able to recognize that we are receiving gifts from this kind of people is a contribution to the construction of a more pacific and a more ecological world.
Maybe 2 points. First of all, so I agree that the solutions to many of the contemporary problems cannot be but global. Yes, Marseille, yes, I don't know, Lviv, Toronto won't be able to solve their own problems without cooperation with other countries, etc. Yes, ecology is a beautiful example. On the other hand, when you look at European Union, you see that it's already almost too big to be able to feel its belonging to this unity. You are not effectively connected to it. And it's even maybe paradoxical that the Catholic Church, which is, yes, in terms of population, is larger than European Union, provides you a certain, yes, sense of emotional belonging, while European Union, which is probably what, 4 times smaller, doesn't. So I don't want to say that if you are too big, you can't create a sense of belonging, but it's probably a different sense of belonging. So at the end of the day, I think this Afanassiev's, Zizula's intuition that you need a community to be part of the church is true. If you are anonymous, if you belong to a church universal without belonging to a community, if you don't know the people in your church, if you don't help them, now you have a question whether it can be virtual or not, and perhaps I can concede that you can have a virtual, but still you need to know people, to be helped by those people and to help them. Otherwise you don't have community. The second point, and I think it will bring also the question of ecumenism on board. The story of Antichrist, yes, told by Solovyov. Yes, I think it's very interesting in this regard. Yes, you have a story when there is a great person who achieves a global peace, wealth, unity, everybody is happy, united, there are no wars. He is elected, what I think a president of European state, something like that. It was almost a prophecy in the European Union, and then whatever, the president of the world. And then he wants to unite churches, and they refuse, or only part of them are united. And I think this intuition suggests that like this, the whole world living together is, at least for Solovyov, a sign of Antichrist, because it creates a totalizing space in which you can't live freely. Yeah, you can escape from one nation state. You can escape from, I don't know, China, Russia, Ukraine. If the world is the planet, you don't have where to escape. Yes, as Schmidt would say, you don't have political. Yes, but the story doesn't end here. Those Christians, Protestants, Orthodox, and Catholic that refuse to this globalizing project, they escape. Some are killed and some escape to the deserts, and they unite there. So there is a way of unity which is profoundly, I don't know, Christian, but which is not this cosmopolitan unity. So I think there are different, shades of gray, different shades of cosmopolitanism, of unity, if you want. Thank you.
Abraham Han has another question, but maybe I'll try to.
Maybe I can put it if you want.
Okay, try you, because you probably have. Yes, must have.
Not only my.
I would like to. I would pass or stay down for a new voice. So if it's a new person coming on, let's hear them, and then I'll follow afterwards.
I don't see other questions, Abraham. So
okay.
you can speak. They are entering the, but I don't think they are asking questions. Yes.
Yes. Let me make some declarations, because some of you do not know me. I am at the Toronto School of Theology. And, I studied theology at Yale and at McGill. I also work in the area of philosophy of religion. I am also a Lutheran, and at times I can be non-Christian. I also teach in an ecumenical kind of setting, and my college is really it's a really Anglican background. Now, having said all of that, now let me then say this. I'm trying to think, what's the job of a theologian in relation to all of this? I'm not trying to be, as with some theologians, trying to be political scientists and sociologists. So I'm trying to think that in this particular context, what's the task of the theologian? And it seems to me that I'm not going to propose what the task of the theologian is, but I'll share some thoughts, and that is that it seems to me that in a sense, there's a tendency in Christianity and in Catholicism, or the notion of Catholicity, to think in terms of unity, in praise of unity. And even with respect to imperium as opposed to auctoritas, implying some kind of transcendent sort of relationship, imperium seems to be in the service of unity. This then raises the question as to, what's the theologian's task, really? And it seems to me that we can't really answer that question until we answer very clearly the anthropological one, the philosophical or theological kind of anthropology, and that is what's the human condition. And is the human condition a kind of fragmentation in order to bring about a unity in relation to an accountability of ourselves in terms of eternity? Or is it a kind of unity to make a happy camper kind of family, happy camper situation, that we're all kind of happy campers in this world, before God? Yeah. So it comes back to how we really kind of understand within Christianity the question. It's a more salvific kind of question, how we parse that. Let me stop here and see what happens. In other words, are we too hung up on unity? And we really think that salvifically, we're supposed to be one big happy camper family. In
thank
eternity.
you, Abraham, for the question. It's a difficult question. I think that like all the theologians, in a way, are concerned with that. Yes, what does it mean to be theologian? Now, in terms of, I think the topics of today's seminar, where we tried, yes, with look, so to look both on the unity of humanity and on the unity of the church through the same lenses, was sort of a test whether it makes sense to look, to ask the same questions to the humanity as we do for the church. Certainly, historically, you have all sorts of critiques which say, for example, Western Western imperialism is based in the missionary nature of Christianity. Yes, those critiques exist. They are probably questions more for a social scientist than for a theologian. Yeah, that's a question of the history of ideas. But I think a theologian would ask himself the question, yes, that you asked previously, like, are two levels, the level of society, human community, and the level of church as community, I know, both apples, or one is apple and another is orange? Now, as a theologian, I think we need to work, and our reflection should be for the salvation of the world. Yes, so we need to be concerned about the church, but also about humanity as such. Yes, not maybe in a, I don't know, colonialistic, paternalistic way, but concerned with humanity. Yes, this beautiful document that was published by theologians attached to the Patriarchate of Constantinople, yes, for the which uses, I think, Schmemann's phrase for the salvation of the world, yes, or for the being of the world. I think it was on the social doctrine of the Orthodox Church. So the idea is that we are there for the world, and our reflection can serve the salvation of the world. At the same time, I think without understanding the world, the politics, we don't understand ecclesiology and the church and God. Or Taras tells me that it was for the life of the world, for the life of the world. Now, when we speak about the kingdom of God, yes, Jesus wasn't preaching the church. It was the priests who started doing that later on. I'm joking. Yes, Jesus preached the kingdom of God, and well, kingdom is a political concept. God as a king, it's a political concept. To speak about kingdom is to speak about politics. So how a theologian can speak about kingdom of God if he doesn't understand what kingdom is? Now you have the work of, I don't know, Jan Assmann, yes, an Egyptologist who shows you how, for example, Egyptian ideas, Sumerian ideas about the relationship between, I don't know, the vassals and the king have influenced the Holy Scriptures, the Old Testament, the way of this, the idea of a jealous God, etc. So it's like politics influencing theology all the time. And I think that's why a theologian must study the social sciences, build on that in order to understand theology, yes, and in order to be able to serve the world. This would be my very, I think, I don't know, inadequate answer, yes, to your question. Maybe Luke, who has a much bigger experience as a theologian, can answer in a more, I don't know, robust way.
Well, thank you once more, Abraham, for your very interesting question. Very interesting and very difficult at the same time. I would say, I would answer thinking about from your question. I'm not sure I will answer it, but I will try to think of, starting from your question, what is the vocation of theology today? I would say three characteristics, according to me. The first would be a theologian is a man or woman who is able to control the use of analogy, because we always think with analogy, and it's sometimes we risk to misuse the analogies. For example, in ecclesiology, which is my specialty, church is not only a body; it's a people, and it's a shrine, and it's a field. And it's sheep and so on. So you have different analogies, and you have to be able to control the use of analogies. So that's the first the first characteristic, according to me. The second one would be not to mix history and eschatology, which is the same thing like Pavlo just told us about kingdom and church. The problem of thinking of unity is to mix eschatology, which is the recapitulation of the world creation into God, not only the humankind, but the world creation in God through Christ, and the history. And the history is not the eschatology, and so on. So to control the difference between history and eschatology is one of the skill of theology, according to me, and it makes a difference between theological discourses and political ideologies, according to me. So analogy history and eschatology. And the third characteristic, according to me, but I know it could be discussed, of course, more discussed maybe, the fact that as Christian, we have to face the permanency of Israel. You know, we always risk to think ourselves as the world, especially in the Catholic Church, and especially in the Latin Catholic Church, to think ourselves as the world. But we have always the fact that some people are till now Israel. And by Israel, I mean Israel, not only the state of Israel, but also the state of Israel, and people who is people from Judaism, with the very different types of Jews, as you know. So we have a kind of a prohibition to think that we are now at the eschatological time because Israel is here and is a kind of partner in the world history. So, you know, according to me, the vocation of theology is to control the use of analogy, to be aware of the difference between history and eschatology, and to understand what God wants when he wants the permanency of Israel.
Can I switch my microphone?
Okay, sure. We've got another question from Mr. Konstantin Sigov, and Pavlo will translate it into English. Okay, thank you, Pavlo.
So the question is from Konstantin Sigov, who is a professor in Kiev, and he's in charge of a publishing house and an ecumenical center, and council for the ministry department for religions and ethnicities. So he asks about the analogy between a parish and the Church Universal on the one hand, and on the other hand, European Union and a community. As for Ukraine, it's a challenge because we would like to join European Union. So he asks whether in a given city, yes, you can rise communities that we will be educating people to a European style of life and will join them to European for European future. And whether you can have a parallel between a parish and the Church Universal with a community able to raise Europeans, if you want. You can, okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this question. Of course, it's difficult for me to answer for two reasons. First of all, because I am in a country who wants to belong to the European community, to the European Union, sorry, and we know that it's very difficult for geopolitical reasons. So, and secondly, because we are at the very moment when France will, in a few months, be the leader of the European Union, and at the same time was full of questions because we are divided about economics, about politics, about geopolitics, and so on and so on. So it's very difficult indeed to answer to such a question. But I would say that the question, the main issue, according to me, is to which point is it possible to make an analogy between the political life and the church life? To which point? For example, if we say the parish and universal church in front of nation and United Nations and United European Union, to which point this analogy is correct? I would say it's difficult because for many reasons. Well, because it's always a question of imagination. You know, analogy needs the use of imagination. So, from this point of view, theology is a science, is a very specific science, because it is a science. You have to demonstrate something with a plan, with a way of reasoning, like philosophy. But it's very different from philosophy, because we use always analogy, which oblige us to work with imagination, to use imagination. And why? Because we have the Bible, and the Bible is built with analogy, imagination, and so on and so on. So, I would say that the question behind, one of the questions behind the use of such an analogy is to think the public life of the church with the use of political imagination. It is true to a certain point, but we have to, at the same time, to imagine our church life with liturgical analogies, which are completely different from political, with spiritual, because with spirituality, I mean inner life, which is very different from political life, and so on. And lastly, I would say that the parish has never been the only way of living his church life. The bishop is not only in charge of, in the Catholic ecclesiology, the bishop is not only in charge of managing the parishes, but he has under his vigilance also the religious community, also the relief assistants, also the spiritual groups, also the youth groups, and so on and so on and so on. So parish life has never been the only way of being a Christian, thanks to God. I've been parish priest, so I know that. So you have plenty of ways to live your Christian life outside the parishes, but the Catholic ecclesiology, as you know, makes the diocese as well the normal place to live one's life. Or in our situation, the question of territory, like Pavlo told us 5 minutes ago, is the main question, thanks to the technical question and so on. So to which point is it possible to imagine a non-territorial Christian life? To which point? Facebook now is named as Meta, because they want to make a metaverse, so a world which is completely virtual. According to me, it's a nightmare. And so, not only a nightmare, it's a tragedy and a political tragedy. So to which point is it possible to live a Christian life without territorial implementation? This would be, according to me, a very difficult question. And I'm thinking about gypsies, about migrants, and about soldiers.
Can I switch my?
Yeah, sure. Please.
Yes, thank you, Konstantin. It's a very, very interesting question and difficult. So I will maybe build on what Luke said about the possibility of analogy. But I would maybe approach it from a different perspective. So European values, universal values. Yes, if you speak about a community that educates to, yes, for European future, yes, you said European future, for whatever, to make Ukraine ready to join the European Union. The question to ask also, I think in the framework of the seminar on Catholicity, Universality, is, are European values universal values? Now, one of the possible questions is yes, they are. Yes, the French Revolution, yes, liberté, égalité, fraternité, there is nothing very Gaulois about that. No, those are universal values. US, United States, also universal values. Human rights, religious freedom, liberalism, etc. Now, why France and America are not one country if they both have universal values? So I'm very serious. Eh? So if we say, if the answer we give that European values are, Europe has its own identity, which is in Christian roots, yes, as somebody does, and it's different from Turkey or from China because it has Christian roots. My question is, what makes Europe different from America or from Australia? Yes, which also, yes, you can have, say, arguably, whatever, have European culture. Although I know that Luke will, yes, disagree. So where do the values, what are European values? And I think it's all an ongoing discussion, because if you don't know what are European values, how you would prepare people for European values? Yeah. If they are universal values, you are educating cosmopolitan people or Europeans. So I think this is a question, what do we mean by European future? Now, let's ask the same question for the church. Are parishes educating Christians with universal values? Are church values universal values? If we say that, yes, the church is there for humanity and Christ is there to recapitulate all creation and humanity, then we would say, yes, church values are universal values. To join everybody in Christ. But then why do we have a Greek Catholic parish and Roman Catholic parish and Armenian parish? So they would probably give some values that are not universal values, because otherwise there is no point about having Latin, Greek Catholic and Armenian Catholic parish. This brings us to the question, back to the question of language. You cannot teach universal language without a particular culture. So this universalism can be integrated. And the question is how we Ukrainians, yes, make European values our own values. Yeah, Maidan, maybe Father Rudejko, who is here, yes, can tell us more about that, was, and Taras Temor, yes, who are both like Maidanists, or how to call them, they, yes, that was an attempt for Ukraine to articulate European values, European identity, European effervescence, to put it in Durkheimian words, at European level. And it created a community. Certainly, if you, and I think this, Professor Sigo then says asks whether the experience of the parishes can be interesting for the civil life. I would say definitely, because if you don't have a community, then your belonging is ideological. So that's why nationalism appears when you don't have communities anymore. People travel to the cities. Yes, it's an anonymous existence. People don't know each other. They need an abstract identity because they don't belong to a community, village community, whatever. I'm simplifying here things, but I think the idea is that if you don't have a community, you would have ideology. If European values are not practiced at a community level, yes, in your city, in your village, in your neighborhood, then it's European ideology. You will think that you are European or pro-European, but it will be like ideological Europeanism, not a way of belonging to a European polis, I would say. But thank you for the question.
Just one more point from this very interesting question, just to say that what could be the contribution of theology to these very difficult political questions about, for example, European values, is that for us, Christian, there is no value. There is a narrative. There is a history in which we are integrated. So because of the main question about education or about constituting a nation is or a United Nations or so on is how is it possible? And we Christians are witnessing the fact that we do not build any belonging without a narrative, without a story we are able to receive and to share. So the narrative is not only the biblical narrative, but also the narrative of the local parish or the nation and so on. As all parish priests know, when we arrive in a new parish, the first thing is to be different from the apocalypse, I make all things new. The first is to listen to people to understand what is the story of the parish. And you can help people to make one step further. Sometimes it's even not very difficult, but you enter in a history. So I would say that the contribution of Christianity to political life is through narrative, and the contribution of theologian to this process is to be able to understand what narrative is and how is it possible to be aware of the danger and of the risk and the opportunities of such a narrative.
Okay. I guess this is the right time to finish our session, and I want to express my gratitude to our speakers, touching very narrow question for the church life. And I suppose that your presentation will be printed, will be published on our website, both in Ukrainian and in English. And I'm taking responsibility to translate them into Ukrainian, okay, personally. Okay, in order for other people to see it, to appreciate, and to get known this. And the video will be available on our institute website and on our site on the Facebook. So thank you very much for all those who attended our session and dedicated their time to this very interesting topic. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah.